I was deadheading the zinnias when I saw the car. Black Lexus, rental plate. Pulled up the gravel like it belonged here. It didn't. There are cars that say grief and cars that say grievance. This one said the latter. I stood, wiped my hands on my jeans, and waited. It was Diane, of course. Driver's side. Sunglasses too large for her face. Evan stepped out behind her, tall, hunched, carrying a canvas bag that looked too soft to contain anything useful. They hadn't called ahead. They hadn't called at all. "You're out early," Diane said, glancing at my gloves. "I live here," I replied. "Still?" she murmured, loud enough for her brother to hear, but soft enough to pretend she hadn't said it. Evan gave me a polite nod, the way you nod at someone you once thought would be gone by now. They didn't ask to come inside. They just started walking toward the house. I stepped aside, slowly, because there's a difference between surrender and observation. "Is this a visit?" I asked. "We need to take care of a few things," Diane said, not slowing. I wasn't aware anything was left. She stopped at the door, looked at me with a familiar blend of contempt and performance. "I think we'll be the judge of that." They walked into Richard's house like tourists in a museum they used to own. Diane's heels clicked on the tile. Evan's bag thudded softly as he dropped it by the hall bench, like he might be staying. "We'll just take a quick look at Dad's office," she said over her shoulder. "Then we'll get out of your hair." I stood in the entryway, unsure whether I was supposed to trail them or stay rooted. It occurred to me that I didn't owe them coffee. I didn't even owe them comfort. But habits die slower than people. So I followed, slowly, glove still in hand. They were already in Richard's study, the room I hadn't stepped into since the funeral. Diane opened drawers without asking. Evan knelt by a box labeled Tax 2012-2020 and began thumbing through folders. "I packed those myself," I said. "They were already sorted. We just want to double check." "For what?" "For anything we missed." Diane smiled without her eyes. I watched her fingertips trace the edge of Richard's desk, not in affection, but in calculation. She looked like a woman trying to memorize the perimeter of a crime scene. "You haven't changed anything in here," she noted. "No." "Why not?" "Because I was grieving." Evan glanced up at me. His eyes flicked down almost immediately, as if he couldn't quite decide if I was too formal or too present. After 10 minutes of rifling, Diane said lightly, "You know, Helen, technically, this house is part of the estate. There's still some legal clarity to work out. The will was filed. The house is mine." "That's what the document says, but documents can be complicated." She smiled again, this time with full intent. "I just want to make sure nothing here was signed under pressure." I said nothing, because silence can be a wall, and because I didn't trust my voice not to shake. "We'll be back tomorrow," Diane said. "There are a few photo albums we want, and maybe some furniture." "You could have asked first." "We're family," she said flatly. "No need for formalities." She brushed past me in the hallway, perfume trailing behind like smoke. Evan gave me a tighter nod this time, a little ashamed, not enough to stop. Then they were gone. The door clicked shut behind them. The silence they left was louder than their arrival, and heavier. I went back out to the garden, back to the zinnias. Sat on a stone bench Richard installed the year we were married. The soil was still soft from yesterday's rain, and the gloves in my hands were shaking. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just whispered. Not to the air, not to Richard, not to God. They're not here to grieve. They're here to erase me. But I will not go quietly. They arrived at 9:07 a.m., exactly when Diane said they would. Not late, not early, right on time, like a meeting she didn't want to have, but was going to win. Evan carried a cardboard box. Diane had a clipboard, a stack of labeled tabs, and a zip-up pouch that looked suspiciously like the one Richard used to keep important documents in. "We'll be quick," she said as they stepped inside. "Just want to make sure we're all aligned." "On what?" I asked. "What's where, what's his, what's still open?" She said it like an estate was a spreadsheet that hadn't yet been reconciled. I made coffee. I didn't offer them any. They didn't ask, which told me everything I needed to know about how this would go. The first thing Diane did was head to the dining room. She stood in front of the antique hutch Richard had inherited from his mother, opened both doors. "This was your mother's, right?" she asked me over her shoulder. "No," I said without moving. "Yours." "It's lovely." She tapped something on her phone. Evan moved toward the sideboard. "Is that the sterling set Mom used to bring out for holidays?" "No," I said. "This one's mine. I brought it from Boston." He paused. "Oh." Didn't apologize. Didn't backtrack. Just moved on. I watched as Diane began peeling small circular stickers off her clipboard, red, blue, green, and applying them to furniture. One to the mirror in the hallway, one to the coat rack near the door. "What are those?" I asked. "Markers, so we don't double count anything." "Are we counting?" "Not formally, just tracking." "For what?" She smiled. "For the lawyers, just in case." She put a blue sticker on the oil painting in the hallway, the one of the birch trees in early smell. "Dad bought this in Maine, didn't he?" "We bought it together. Camden Art Walk, 2012. "Oh." Another mark on the clipboard, another square claimed, as if grief gave them a map and I was just a trespasser inside it. They moved room to room, listing, whispering, occasionally opening a drawer without asking. I trailed a few feet behind. I didn't stop them. I didn't help. I simply watched. And then I began my own list. Not on a phone, not with colored dots, but on the back of an old gardening catalog I found folded in the drawer of Richard's desk. "Items of value," I wrote in small, neat script. His watch in my nightstand, the letters he wrote after his surgery, boxed under bed, the pinewood chess set from our trip to New Hampshire, the brass cuff he bought me, never gave them, the garden journal, mine now. I wasn't listing to defend myself. I was listing to remember, because they didn't know what mattered. Not really. At noon, Diane announced they were done for now. She didn't look at me when she said it. Evan gave me a quick, guilty smile. "We'll just send a quick digest of what we saw," she added, "so we can all stay aligned. Transparency, you know." "Of course," I said. "But what I meant was, I see you, and I don't need your transparency. I already know what you came for." They left behind a thin trail of boot prints, 3 blue stickers, and the faint smell of hotel laundry detergent. I peeled the stickers off before they even reached the car. 1, 2, 3. Tossed them in the compost bin with the garden clippings. Let them rot with the weeds. That evening, I took out the gardening catalog again and flipped it over. Wrote, "Today they touched everything with his name on it. Tomorrow, they'll come for what doesn't have one." I am not a relic. I am not a temporary occupant. And I am not done. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, nothing had changed. And that's exactly what they hated. The law office was small, old wood, new carpet, too much air freshener. There were no tissues on the table, which told me this wasn't the kind of office that expected people to cry. Just sign and leave. The lawyer's name was Dennis Holt, a man with kind eyes and no illusions. He greeted me first, firmly. "Thank you for coming." "Of course. You brought identification?" "Yes." "Then let's begin." Diane and Evan arrived 5 minutes late. Evan wore a sweater that looked one size too large. Diane wore a look that said, "This is just a formality." She didn't smile. She didn't look at me. She sat like she'd been summoned unfairly. Dennis began, the voice of a man who's read too many lives in too few pages. "This is the last will and testament of Richard Stephen Marshall, dated July 18th, 2023. I felt the shift in the room before anything was even said. Diane sat straighter. Evan leaned forward slightly, as if the paper might whisper something different if he listened hard enough. "All real estate holdings, possessions, and assets not designated elsewhere shall pass to my wife, Helen Marshall, with full and uncontested authority. A small trust," Dennis continued, "in the amount of $15,000 each is to be dispersed to the testator's adult children, Diane Marshall and Evan Marshall, for the purpose of personal use and remembrance. All remaining estate value is to remain in Helen Marshall's control, with no requirement of division or redistribution." Silence. Then Diane laughed, once, sharp. "This is a joke." Dennis said nothing. He just tapped the notarization. "He was ill when this was written." "He was not under cognitive distress," Dennis replied evenly. "I was present. He was of sound mind. He didn't know what he was signing. He signed in front of 2 witnesses. He brought the document in himself. I did not draft it. I simply executed it." Evan looked tired, like he was already halfway out the door emotionally, unsure of which room he belonged in. Diane was doing all the speaking and all the burning. "He was manipulated," she said, louder now. "She kept us from him. She knew he was sick and used it to—" "That's enough," I said quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken. They both turned to look at me, and I made sure not to flinch. "If you have something to contest, do it through the court, but don't rewrite the story just because you were too proud to show up before the ending." Diane stared at me like I had just shattered something expensive. "You're not family," she snapped. "You were never family." "Then what exactly do you think I stole?" I said. She didn't answer, just stood, gathered her bag, and stormed out, leaving the door open behind her. Evan followed, slower. Before he left, he turned to Dennis. "Can we see the original?" Dennis nodded. "Of course, you'll get a copy today." When they were gone, I didn't say anything. Dennis waited. Then, after a moment, he reached into his desk drawer and handed me a sealed envelope. My name, handwritten in ink I recognized, the curve of the H, the slant of the M. "He asked me to give this to you privately. He said you'd know when to open it." "Did he tell you what it was?" "No." "Did he seem different that day?" Dennis smiled, very faintly. "He seemed settled." I drove home with the letter in the passenger seat. Didn't open it at the red light. Didn't open it in the driveway. I set it on the kitchen table, next to the garden journal. Then I made tea, sat by the window, and let the silence decide. Later that night, I opened it. The letter was short, 4 sentences. His handwriting was steady, clear, and darker than usual, as if he pressed the pen harder that day. "Helen, if they come for you, don't argue, don't explain. Let the paper speak. I made the choices they couldn't. The house is yours. You made it one. I'm sorry for what I didn't say. Richard." I folded it back into the envelope, placed it between pages 44 and 45 of my garden journal, the page where I'd drawn the layout of the spring tulips. They'll bloom again soon, and when they do, I'll be here, still standing, still choosing. The email came 2 days after the will reading. Subject line: following up, estate transparency. Not, hello. Not, how are you holding up? Not even, I'm sorry. Just, transparency. Diane had always loved that word. She used it the way some people use bless your heart, with sharpness disguised as courtesy. The message was 3 paragraphs, all clipped sentences, professional tone, clean formatting. In the interest of clarity and mutual respect, Evan and I would appreciate the opportunity to review Richard's financial history over the last 3 to 5 years, particularly accounts that may have changed after his illness. We hope you understand this request is not accusatory, just a way to ensure everything is settled fairly. Please let us know when we can meet or review documents together. Fairly. Another word that means give us what we want before we demand it in court. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I made a pot of tea, chamomile this time. Then I opened Richard's desk drawer, pulled out the ledger he'd kept, handwritten, not digital. 2 leather-bound notebooks, every check, every deposit, every withdrawal recorded in his tight, spidery script. There were receipts tucked inside like fossils, staples fading, ink bleeding at the edges, but everything was there. On the back of the envelope Richard had written the will letter in, I started my own note. Timeline: Richard's illness and estate decisions. First diagnosis, March 2022. Fay 2022. Update will drafted, July 2023. Sitnessed by Dennis Holt and 2 paralegals. No child visited between December 2021 through February 2024. Misplaced or estate changes in final 90 days. I wasn't building a case. I was securing the walls. Because Diane wasn't asking. She was probing, testing, trying to see if I'd flinch. I copied the ledgers at the library, not because I had to, but because I wanted backups somewhere Diane didn't know existed. I boxed the originals, labeled them with my own handwriting. Do not destroy. Do not lend. I placed the box beneath the guest bed, the one no one sleeps in anymore. Later that evening, I replied to Diane. Simple, direct. Thank you for your note. All estate accounts and documentation are already processed and on file with Mr. Holt. Any further questions should be directed to him. Helen. No greeting, no closing. Just the mirror of her own tone. The next morning I got a reply, shorter this time. Understood. I'll follow up with Mr. Holt. D. That was it. No argument, no apology, but I could feel it. The pause, the tension, the slow click of her realizing I wouldn't be baited into a war of words. Outside, the frost was lifting from the topsoil. The first crocus shoots had appeared near the lilac bush. I bent down and touched one with the back of my glove. Thin, delicate, but certain. I didn't tell Janice about the email, not yet. I didn't need anyone to say, "Oh, honey, they'll come after everything," because I already knew, and I wasn't afraid anymore. That night I sat at the kitchen table and wrote in the garden journal. Today I started building a second house, not with walls, but with facts. Not to protect myself, to remind myself I was never afraid of the truth, only of being buried under someone else's version of it. Then I folded the email, filed it with the others, let her words sit there on paper, because that's all they were, and I was done letting paper define me. Janice's house sits 2 driveways down. Same age as mine, same peeling trim, but painted robin's egg blue with stubborn pride. She still grows rhubarb out front, just to annoy the HOA that never arrived. When I knocked, she called out before opening, "If you're selling religion, I already have regrets. If you're selling knives, I already have dull ones." I smiled through the screen. "Just came for rhubarb wisdom." "Well then," she said, unlatching the door, "bring wine next time." We sat on her porch with mugs of weak coffee and a shared blanket over our knees like old war generals in retreat. Janice was 80, sharp as barbed wire, and fond of saying she'd buried 3 husbands, 1 to cancer, 1 to bourbon, and 1 by choice. She looked at me long before speaking. "You're too quiet lately." "That's not new." "No, but the reason is." I didn't explain right away. Just sipped the coffee and watched a squirrel terrorize her bird feeder with operatic determination. Finally, I said, "Diane and Evan think I stole the house. They've started probing, quietly, legally, and loudly, emotionally, I bet. Not to me, not since the will. To other people, then." "What do you mean?" She tilted her head. "Helen, do you think you're the only one they've spoken to? The only one they've tried to recruit?" That landed like a cold spoon between my ribs. "What have they said?" "Not much, just enough. Little sideways things. About how you met Richard before the divorce was final. About how they hadn't been welcomed at the house. About how their father changed after you moved in." "That's not true." "I know. But the thing about poison is, it works in small drops." I looked down at my hands. I thought if I stayed calm, didn't react, didn't stoop, they'd give up. They'd see I wasn't the villain. Janice snorted. "Sweetheart, they need a villain. They can't bury their guilt without a grave to throw it in." The wind picked up. Leaves scraped across the porch like restless fingers. Janice wrapped the blanket tighter around her knees. "I saw what you did with this place. I saw what Richard was like after he married you. That man smiled for the first time in 20 years without wincing." "Then why doesn't that matter to them?" "Because love doesn't cancel out regret, and they regret not trying harder. So now they'll try too late and blame you for the timing." Let it settle in my chest like a coin dropped in a deep well. Then I asked, "Should I start defending myself? Start explaining?" "Depends," she said, sipping her coffee. "Are you trying to win or trying to live?" I didn't answer, not yet, because I wasn't sure. All I knew was this. I had been treating my silence like armor, but maybe it was just a cage. Janice reached over and patted my knee. "You don't have to yell, but maybe stop whispering." I wouldn't know where to begin. "Then start with what's yours. Name it out loud. Then let no one take it again without hearing your voice first." On my walk home, I saw Diane's car again, parked a block away, engine off, windows tinted. I didn't approach, didn't wave. I simply walked past, chin up, spine straight, like a woman who wasn't checking over her shoulder anymore. That night, I unlocked the drawer in Richard's desk, pulled out the garden ledger, and for the first time I wrote something that wasn't a list. just a sentence. She is trying to turn me into a rumor. I will remain a fact. The guest room had always been a quiet space, unclaimed, unvisited, unused. I only stepped in to change sheets or chase out the winter spiders, but that morning I walked in without thinking. Something had pulled me there, maybe the quiet, maybe the unfinished corner of my mind, maybe Richard. The sunlight was creeping across the rug, catching on a warped edge of the floor beneath the bed. The wood had always been slightly uneven, just enough to snag a sock, not enough to fix. We used to joke about it. Add it to the list, he'd say, grinning. We never made a list. I knelt down, slid my hand beneath the bed, and pressed against the edge of the loose plank. It shifted, lifted. Not by much, but enough. There was a folder tucked inside, thin, unmarked, yellowed at the corners like something ashamed of itself. I sat on the bed before opening it. My hands were colder than they should have been. Inside, wood, printed bank statements from an account I'd never seen. A copy of an old will, dated 2017, naming Diane and Evan as sole heirs. Amazon letter from Richard's first wife addressed to my children. And finally, a single folded sheet in Richard's handwriting. It wasn't sealed, but it might as well have been, because once I read it, I wouldn't be able to unread it. I started with the account statements. They showed transfers, small monthly ones, from Richard's business account into a trust fund. The name on the trust, Marshall Family Revocable Trust. Beneficiaries, Diane and Evan. It had been closed out in 2021, right around the time Richard got his diagnosis. The letter from his ex-wife was dated 1999. She was sick then, the year before she died. It was restrained, almost formal. I hope you'll forgive your father. He didn't leave because of someone else. He left because he didn't know how to be forgiven. A strange thing to say, a stranger thing to leave behind. Then I opened the last page, Richard's note. His handwriting was tired, heavier than usual. Helen, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here, and it means Diane's making noise. The old will was never destroyed, just replaced. I didn't want to leave them nothing, but I couldn't give them more than they'd earned. I know how that sounds. I know you won't like it. I kept the trust going for years after their mother passed, even when they wouldn't return my calls. But in the end, you were the one who stayed. You were the one who built this place. They came with guilt, not grace. I made my peace with that. I hope you can too. Don't let them turn you into a placeholder. The house is yours. The garden is yours. They were just born here. You lived here. R. I sat still for a long time. No tears, no breath. Just the slow, careful ache of understanding something too late to say out loud. He had tried. To be fair, to be decent, to leave no one hurting. And he'd hidden the hurt. From them, from me, from himself maybe most of all. I put everything back in the folder. Every page, every line. Then I slipped it under the bed again, but only for a moment, because hiding it again wouldn't protect me, and pretending I didn't know wouldn't protect him. That night I made a copy, placed the original in a box marked private, legal hold, and stored it in the garden shed behind the old pots and seed trays. Let them come searching. They wouldn't find what they wanted. Then I wrote one more line in the journal. There's a difference between inheritance and history. They were given his name. I was given the truth. The cafe Diane chose was downtown, too modern, too staged. Polished concrete floors, exposed brick, staff that called you friend without knowing your name. I wore my plain navy cardigan, no makeup, no defense, just presence. Diane was already seated when I arrived, of course. Her coffee was half gone, her expression was full. "Helen, you look well." "I am well." She didn't like that answer. Sitting beside her was a woman with short, silver hair, thin wire glasses, and the kind of calm that feels practiced, like a tour guide in a war museum. "This is Margaret," Diane said. "She's a friend of the family. She used to be a counselor, just here to help us all stay constructive." "Neutral," the woman added, "just here to facilitate clarity." I ordered tea, didn't drink it. Margaret began, folding her hands neatly over a yellow notepad. "I understand things have been difficult since Richard's passing." "He passed, yes." "And sometimes," she said gently, "even with the best intentions, family members can feel left out of major decisions, especially when grief is involved." I watched Diane sip her coffee with theatrical restraint. No milk, no sugar, just black bitterness. Fitting. "Let's be clear," I said. "This isn't about grief. This is about property." "And perception," Diane added quickly. "What perception?" "The perception," she said, "that you isolated him. That we weren't allowed in his final months. You didn't come. We weren't invited." "You were never uninvited." Margaret raised a hand, like a judge silencing a gallery. "Let's pause there. We're not here to relitigate the past. We're here to look forward." "And why am I being asked to explain what's already been settled?" I asked. Margaret smiled like a therapist who thinks she's clever. "Because unresolved feelings have a way of infecting settled facts." And there it was, the whole purpose of this meeting, to shift the emotional burden back onto me, to imply that maybe I did something wrong even if I didn't, all for appearances. I looked at Diane. Her face was blank. Her ring finger tapped the coffee lid, 3 short beats, the rhythm of entitlement. "Did you bring her here to counsel me?" I asked. "No," Diane said. "Did you pay her?" A pause. Then, "She's volunteering her time. Because she knows me. Because she knows what families look like when people stop communicating." I stood. Didn't touch the tea, didn't touch the anger, just picked up my purse and said, "I thought we were here to resolve something. Turns out, we're just here to rewrite it." Margaret frowned. "Helen, walking away doesn't solve anything." "It's not supposed to." "So what does this mean?" "It means I'm done defending myself to people who arrive late and want to be handed the script." Diane stood too. "You're being hostile." "No, just direct. Try it sometime." I left without saying goodbye, because not every departure needs closure. Some just need clarity. That night, I wrote in my journal. I spent 14 years planting things. They've spent 14 weeks uprooting shadows. Let them try. I'm not a caretaker anymore. I'm a witness, and I will not soften the edges of the truth for their comfort. Outside, the daffodils had begun to open, slow, yellow, blunt with joy. Miles's office was tucked above a bakery. No glass tower. No mahogany desk. Just a small, sunlit room that smelled faintly of yeast and copy toner. He greeted me like an old neighbor, which, in a way, he was. "Helen Marshall," he said, shaking my hand warmly. "I was hoping you'd stop by someday." "Why?" "Because you've been walking around with a storm cloud on your shoulder since Richard passed, and you're not the kind of woman who hides weather well." I smiled, despite myself. "You were always good at noticing things." And you were always good at fixing them. My roses are still alive because of you. They're stubborn, not me. Both, he said. We sat. The chair creaked beneath me like a confidant. I slid the folder across the desk, the one from under the floorboard. They're circling, I said simply. Miles didn't rush to open it. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. Tell me everything. So I did. Not every word, but enough. The stickers, the inventory, the cafe stunt with the so-called mediator, the email, the implied accusations, the will reading, the letter from Richard. I didn't cry. I didn't dramatize. I just laid it out like planting rows of beans, steady, deliberate, factual. When I finished, Miles finally opened the folder, read quietly for several minutes. Then he looked up. They don't have a case. That won't stop them. No, he said, but it means we can choose how they lose. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. What do you need from me? Copies of everything. Bank records, medical documentation, Richard's diagnosis timeline, statements from anyone who saw the two of you together in those last months, neighbors, friends, even grocery clerks, anything that shows continuity of care. Continuity? That you weren't a stranger suddenly controlling his decisions, that you were his partner in fact, not just in name. I thought of Janice, of Tom with his firewood, of Dr. Klein who treated Richard through his chemo. Faces, names, people who had witnessed our lives not as rumor, but as reality. I can do that, I said. Good. And one more thing. Don't talk to them alone anymore. If they want to meet, if they want to clarify, direct them through me. Even if they show up at the door? Especially then. I nodded. It felt like exhaling after weeks of holding my breath. For the first time, I wasn't bracing. I was building. Miles leaned forward. Helen, they'll try to paint you as manipulative, isolated, unstable. That's the standard play. But you have something stronger than evidence. What? Consistency. You don't have to reinvent yourself. You just have to keep being who you've been all along. Paper trails and affidavits will do the rest. When I left, the bakery downstairs was pulling trays of bread from the oven. The smell of yeast and butter followed me into the street. For the first time in months, I felt hungry. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my garden journal and wrote, Today I found an executor who isn't afraid of ghosts, and maybe that's what I've needed. Not someone to fight, but someone to anchor me while I keep planting. I closed the journal, looked out at the yard. The tulips were taller now, almost ready to break. So was I. The knock came at dusk. 3 sharp raps, impatient. I didn't move right away, just watched the last light bend across the living room floor. When I opened the door, there they were, Diane in a tailored coat, Evan behind her, holding nothing but his own unease. Helen, Diane said, we need a moment. It's not a good time. It won't take long. Her smile was thin, meant for witnesses that weren't there. They stepped forward, expecting me to retreat. I didn't. I kept my body in the doorway, one hand on the frame. We were hoping to collect a few things, Diane continued. Just sentimental items, family photos, maybe Dad's watch. Those are not sentimental, I said. Those are estate assets. Estate assets, like I'd spoken a foreign language. Evan shifted, cleared his throat. Helen, it doesn't have to be complicated. We don't want to fight. We just want pieces of him for closure. Closure, The word tasted like dust. "You can direct those requests to Miles," I said. Diane blinked. "Miles?" "My attorney." For a moment there was silence. Then she laughed, short, brittle. "You hired a lawyer?" "Yes." "Helen, that's unnecessary. We're family. Lawyers escalate things. Lawyers protect things." Evan's gaze dropped to the porch floorboards. Diane's jaw tightened. "You'd rather treat us like criminals than children grieving their father?" "I'd rather treat you like adults who know how to send a formal request." The air snapped between us, cold, sharp, final. Diane leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You think a lawyer changes who he loved? What he promised?" "No," I said, steady, "but it changes what you can take." Evan opened his mouth, closed it again. Diane pulled her coat tighter. "Fine. We'll speak with your Miles." "Do that," I said. And before they could reply, I closed the door. Not slammed, not rushed, just closed, and turned the lock. For a long moment, I stood in the hallway listening. Muffled voices, footsteps down the walk. A car door shutting harder than it needed to. Then silence. I went to the window, pulled back the curtain just an inch. Their tail lights disappeared down the street. And for the first time since Richard's funeral, I felt the weight shift, ever so slightly, back into my own hands. That night I didn't write in the garden journal. I didn't need to. The act itself, closing the door, was the sentence. Complete. Unerasable. Instead, I walked through the house slowly, room by room, touching the edges of things Diane had marked with her little stickers weeks ago. The mirror, the oil painting, the hutch, still here, still mine. I whispered to them. Not prayer, not hope, just fact. They'll bloom under my watch, no one else's. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address. Typed label, Diane's way of dressing a knife in a napkin. Miles had already sent his, 2 days earlier. Simple, clear, professional. All communication must go through this office. No unannounced visits. No unauthorized removal of property. Any further attempts will be treated as harassment. I'd felt strong when it went out, like a shield had finally been lifted in front of me. But when Diane's reply came, I felt the weight land again. I slid it open with Richard's old letter opener. The blade was still sharp. The words inside were sharper. Notice of intent to challenge will. Potential grounds of undue influence. 2 pages, all legal phrasing, all polished venom. They alleged that Richard was in a compromised state when the will was updated, that I had restricted access to him in his final year, that his decision differed materially from his prior estate plans, suggesting coercion. I read it twice, then a third time. Each phrase was designed to sting, but also to seed doubt, not just in court, in me. My hand shook once. Then I put the letter down, walked to the garden, sat on the stone bench beneath the lilac, and breathed. For a moment, I almost believed them. Almost. That's the trick of a well-written accusation. It doesn't need to be true, just repeatable. But then I remembered the journal, the folded page between tulip sketches. I went inside, pulled it out, and read Richard's words again. If they come for you, don't argue, don't explain. Let the paper speak. I made the choices they couldn't. The house is yours. You made it one. It was as if he'd left the sentence right here, waiting for this moment. Not just comfort, evidence, a document in his hand, in his voice, anticipating their accusations. I called Miles. "They've filed intent," I said. "I know, it's bluster, but we'll treat it seriously. They're claiming undue influence. They always do." Richard left a letter. A letter? To me, explaining why he updated the will. Clear, specific. Silence, then a low whistle. "Helen, that's gold. A first-hand statement of intent, contemporaneous, personal, unmistakable. Exactly what a judge looks for." I felt the knot in my chest loosen. Not gone, not undone, but looser. Miles continued. "We'll add it to the file, and we'll add witnesses. Dr. Klein, Janice, Tom. Anyone who saw Richard lucid and deliberate. The more corroboration, the stronger the wall." "The wall," I echoed. "Yes, they're trying to break through with noise. We'll answer with structure." After the call, I sat with the letter again, ran my fingers over the ink. The groove where he pressed harder than usual. It wasn't just paper. It was presence. Proof he'd thought of me. Proof he'd chosen me. Not by accident. Not by manipulation. But by clarity. That night I lit a candle in the kitchen, let the flame catch against the dark window pane. And I wrote in the garden journal, "Today they tried to turn his silence into their weapon, but he left me words, and words weigh more than noise." Outside, the tulips had finally opened, not cautious, not halfway. Open, bold, unapologetic. Like me. The courthouse smelled faintly of varnish and dust. Wooden benches lined the walls. A brass clock ticked above the judge's bench, steady, impartial. Impossible to hurry. I'd never been inside a courtroom before. Not as a defendant, not as a plaintiff. Just a widow with a folder clutched so tightly my knuckles were white. Miles sat beside me, calm as a man on a park bench. He'd said little on the drive over, only, "Remember, truth isn't performance. It doesn't need to sparkle. It just needs to stand." Diane entered 10 minutes later, tailored navy suit, pearls that glinted like armor. Evan trailed behind her, fidgeting, eyes darting. She looked like she owned the room. I felt like I was borrowing air. The bailiff called the session to order. Judge Harris, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, deliberate in every movement, took his seat. Diane's lawyer went first. A younger man, crisp voice, polished gestures. He painted me as the outsider, the second wife who had isolated Richard in his final year, the woman who benefited suspiciously from sudden changes to his will. He spoke of patterns consistent with undue influence. Then Diane herself took the stand. She looked at the judge with practiced sorrow. "My father was a generous man," she said, voice breaking on cue. "But in the last year we barely saw him. Helen always said he was too tired, too sick. We believe she managed what we could and could not see." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. I recognized the gesture, one she'd used at Richard's memorial, a performance of grief, not grief itself. Evan followed. His words were halting, less rehearsed. Dad wasn't himself at the end. He seemed distracted, withdrawn. I don't know if he really knew what he was signing. He avoided my eyes. For the first time, I saw hesitation, not loyalty, fear. When they finished, I could feel the room leaning toward them. The narrative was clean, compelling, easy to believe. For a moment, I thought I'd drown in it. Then Miles stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply began laying stones, one at a time. First, Dr. Klein. She testified that Richard remained lucid until his final weeks, that he had spoken often of wanting to ensure Helen would be secure in the home they had built together. Then, Janice, our neighbor. She recalled Richard pruning roses with me, making jokes, talking about his garden with Helen, just months before the paperwork was signed. Finally, Tom from church. He told the court Richard had confided that he updated his will because he wanted to avoid future quarrels. Each stone Miles laid made the wall higher, harder for Diane to scale, but the last stone was the heaviest. "Your Honor," Miles said, holding up a single sheet of paper, "this is a handwritten letter from Richard Wallace, dated 3 months before his passing. It was found among his personal effects, in his own journal. We submit it as Exhibit F." The bailiff carried it to the judge. I watched Judge Harris adjust his glasses, read in silence. Then he asked, "Mrs. Wallace, would you read this aloud?" My throat tightened, but I stood and read Richard's words into the record. "If they come for you, don't argue, don't explain. Let the paper speak. I made the choices they couldn't. The house is yours. You made it one." The room was silent when I finished. Even Diane's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The judge leaned back. His face betrayed nothing, but something in his eyes softened. Evan glanced down at his hands. He wouldn't look at Diane. For the first time, doubt had cracked his mask. When court adjourned for the day, Miles whispered, "That letter was the turning point. Whatever happens next, the ground has shifted." And for the first time since this war began, I walked out of a room with my back straight, carrying not just a folder, but Richard's voice beside me. The courtroom was quieter than the day before, less crowded, less charged. Just the echo of footsteps on polished floors and the sound of papers being shuffled. Judge Harris took his seat. His expression gave nothing away. "This court has considered the testimony, the exhibits, and the arguments presented," he began. "At issue is whether Richard Wallace's final will was the product of undue influence, or whether it reflected his true and deliberate intent." Diane sat stiff-backed, her lawyer poised with pen in hand. Evan stared at the table, jaw working nervously. I folded my hands in my lap.
No folder, no papers, just Richard's letter resting quietly inside me. The judge continued. "The testimony of Dr. Klein and others established that Mr. Wallace remained of sound mind during the period in question. The handwritten letter, Exhibit F, provides direct and compelling evidence of his intent to provide for his wife. The court finds no credible proof of coercion or manipulation." He paused, looked directly at Diane. "The petition to challenge the will is denied." The words hung in the air like bells, clear, irrevocable. Diane's pen snapped in her hand. Evan finally lifted his eyes, not toward me, but away from her, as though distance itself was a kind of relief. Judge Harris tapped the gavel once. "This matter is settled." And just like that, it was. I walked out without looking back. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just steady, as if the ground itself had leveled beneath my feet again. Miles caught up to me on the courthouse steps. "You did it," he said. "Richard did," I corrected. "Maybe, but you carried it through." He squeezed my shoulder gently. Go home, Helen. Let them stew in their noise. You've got better things waiting. He was right. The tulips were waiting, the lilac bush, the soft churn of soil ready for planting. Back at the house, I slipped off my shoes by the door. The rooms felt lighter somehow, as if the stickers Diane had once placed on every object had lost their stickiness, their meaning. I walked out to the garden. The tulips were open now, red, yellow, white, a stubborn blaze of color against the cool spring air. I bent down, touched one bloom with my fingertips. It felt delicate, but it had pushed through frost, through rain, through everything that tried to stop it. So had I. I sat on the stone bench and opened the garden journal. The page was blank, waiting. I wrote, "They came with paper and accusations. I stayed with soil and memory. The garden is still here. So am I." For a
Sex 0.05.
The wind in the hedge, the faint creak of the gate Richard had meant to fix and never did. Not silence exactly, but peace. I closed the journal, closed my eyes, and in the quiet, I heard him. Not a ghost, not a voice, just the certainty of a choice he'd already made. The house is yours. You made it one. And I finally believed it. Not because a judge said so, not because a lawyer proved it, but because it was always true. The garden, the house, the life we'd built, they weren't trophies to defend. They were roots. And now, they were free to grow again.